It's important that South Carolina has a certain significance in the story of public education and equity for good reasons and bad. I'll start with the good, which is a couple of things. One thing is that on your next trip to South Carolina, y'all will have to visit St. Helena Island, where there is the Penn School, or the Penn Center, which was one of the very first schools for formerly enslaved Africans in the South. It is, President Obama designated it a National Historic Landmark. It still serves as a place of contemplation for those working in social justice and education. It, in fact, was a place of significance for Martin Luther King Jr., where he went with the SLCC during his journey on this, towards this effort. We also, in South Carolina, brought you Briggs versus Elliott, which is another important lawsuit. I know Bishop Waldo mentioned the more recent one that was brought against our legislature, but in the 1950s, courageous family from Clarendon County, which is still one of our poorest districts in South Carolina, brought a case against the separate but equal clause. And that case was one of the 5 that became Brown v. Board of Education. So that took place here in South Carolina. And more recently, South Carolina has given us a program called the Teacher Cadets, which I'm very proud of. This is a program that introduces high school students into the education pipeline. Those that are interested in becoming teachers can get college credit in nearly 70% of any of our school districts in this state. And that program has been replicated in 38 states around the country. So we're very proud to be able to share that with you all. We also have some unfortunate significance in the journey towards education equity. In 2016, the U.S. News and World Report ranked South Carolina's public education system 50th in the nation. We are 48th in terms of overall opportunity. Our children in this state have the highest chance of sliding down the ladder of economic mobility and the lowest chance of going up it. So our kids are facing a real struggle here. In 2016, only 12% of our high school graduates in South Carolina were deemed college ready, as measured by the ACT college test. So we've got some work to do. We're really glad that you're here to help us in this conversation. And so I also just want to say that this is a really tough topic, I think, for us individually and collectively. Lally spoke to this last night, and I want to acknowledge my own inadequacy in talking about it. I am learning about this a lot. I am stumbling a lot. I use the wrong words, and I just want to invite people to help me in that journey. So especially to my panelists, if there's anything that I say that you would like to correct me on, please do. And that goes for the whole conference.
Right. I think we echo that.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, we're learning too.
Right, exactly. So you have the bios of these fabulous, brilliant, amazing social justice warriors in your program. So I'm not going to go through long introductions, but I will ask them to introduce themselves, where they're from, and then just to warm us up, your first encounter with inequity, if you would.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Liz, can we start with you?
I sat here so I would be third.
Good
morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I'm Liz, and I am the Senior Director of Youth Programs at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in the South End of Boston. And if you've read my bio, you know a little bit about this already, but some of my inspiration for my work comes from many summers of being at Girl Scout camp, which gave me a direct understanding of what positive youth development can look like and what developing leadership of young women can look like. In college, I was reconverted to my faith by reading liberation theology from Latin America and womanist theologians from the United States. And I learned a lot alongside radical Roman Catholic nuns who are tackling issues of urban homelessness and domestic violence. And so the primary lens that I use for my work at St. Stephen's is as a community organizer. I've experienced in a variety of ways neighborhood, issue, and labor organizing, but most of my time has been spent doing organizing with teenagers trying to address issues of education and community safety. And I have a special expertise in organizing for cleaner bathrooms in public high schools, since that is one of the things teens care about the most. They innately agree with Maslow, who we talked about last night. How can you learn if you cannot get your most basic needs met? At St. Stephen's, in the programs that I help to run, we strive to promote equity in education, employment, and opportunity through long-term relationships. Relationships with young people, with families, and with neighborhoods. We began 19 years ago with 20 elementary school kids, and now we have about 150 elementary and middle schoolers who come to do some of the same things we did in the beginning, homework and art and having a safe place to be, but now they also get leadership development, do yoga, make friends, and they're part of a community that they often describe as a second home. For teenagers who are part of our program, we offer jobs as mentors to the younger students, academic support, one-on-one mentoring for them to make post-high school plans that fit their interests and are financially viable. In the summertime, we run more programs in different neighborhoods of Boston where we build safe and fun communities for about 500 young people and jobs for 150 teenagers. And we do all this because we engage about 50 suburban Episcopal churches and leverage their resources along with synagogues, evangelical churches, and neighborhood organizations. These relationships with the young people in the neighborhoods have led to why I'm here, because we have a deep commitment to the elementary school that's across the street from our church building. We run the library there. We hire and train parents to be mentors in the classrooms 5 days a week. And we had 250 people volunteering for our 8th annual MLK Day of Action on Monday, doing a variety of projects to improve the learning environment there, as well as the middle school that the students go to after they finish that elementary school. But we know that doing work in one school is not enough, so we also are organizing for funding for public education in the city and statewide. We're mobilizing at the city level to have policies that create more safety for immigrant families, especially in these times, in public schools, so the families and the kids don't have to be afraid to come to school. And we've organized our Spanish-speaking parents to run for the formal leadership roles in their schools, and they swept the table, and they all won. So that's the work that I do. As a white woman who grew up in suburban Long Island, outside of New York City, I had the privilege of not having to think about educational equity of anything that I just described. I walked to my public elementary, middle, and high school without worrying about my safety. My classrooms had enough up-to-date textbooks so that every student could have one. I could take them home. My teachers looked like me. My high school offered enough math and science classes so that I met the basic requirements for college admission, and enough AP classes so that I actually was prepared to go to college. I could get a meeting with my guidance counselor because she had a reasonable caseload, and I didn't even have to think about it. It's only in retrospect that I know some of these things. At the same time, in 6th grade, I was the only girl in a group of 10 students who was chosen for a gifted and talented reading program. I don't think I thought about gender then, but I do now. And as a queer teenager, I knew what it felt like to be called names, to be shunned from cliques, to have my identity and my story missing from my education, and to feel emotionally unsafe, to not have mentors who could help me feel like I was going to be okay. So it's complicated, right? We're complicated people. We cannot be single-issue people because we don't have single-issue lives, as Audre Lorde says. So it is my own complex set of experiences that helps me to have empathy with and be inspired by the young people with whom I now work. And it's why St. Stephen's has grown into the multi-issue community organization that I now get to work with.
All right,
Thank you so much, Liz. Yeah, Kenita, please.
So I'm Kenita Williams. I work with the Southern Education Foundation in Atlanta. Is this on? Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It didn't sound like it. And what we are is what we would call a think action tank. We're a nonprofit that our mission is to advance solutions to advance education equity and excellence for students of color and poor, low-income students in the South. And we particularly focus on the South because we feel like a lot of those issues that we're talking about are amplified in the South, particularly as students of color and poor students are the new majority in Southern schools. So I lead our leadership development work. Specifically, I was building out a program called the Racial Equity Leadership Network, which is a cohort-style fellowship for school district leaders, C-level leaders, superintendents, chiefs of academic officers, and the like, to really build their will, skill, and capacity to advance equity-centered solutions to remedy some of the disparities that we see in race and student outcomes. And really, our work can be summed up in 3 buckets. We do research or data, so we advance the latest data and do analysis on the data. We do convenings, so we bring together thought leaders from all across the region to talk about these issues. And then we do leadership development, and we try to do that across the spectrum because we need a cadre of change agents who are actually going to do the work. So I will say quickly kind of my first experience with equity. It's really interesting because so I'm actually from Oakland, California. So I grew up in the schools that Jeff was talking about last night. And it was just kind of how it was. And I'm like, I knew we didn't have the best textbooks. I knew we didn't have the best teachers. And I knew something was different where I went to a high school that was maybe about 80% Black at the time, but I was the only Black girl in all of my AP classes. So I knew something was up, but I didn't know what it was. And so I went from Oakland to Yale, and I knew that was kind of anomaly at the time and didn't understand why. I just thought I was really blessed, and I have been really blessed, so I acknowledge that. But I also knew that there's something wrong where we're having 1 or 2 students beat the odds instead of changing the odds for all students. But I can honestly say that I didn't know to name it as an equity issue until I had my own daughter. And we were here in schools in Atlanta, and we live in Peachtree City, Georgia, where everybody drives golf carts and kids get dropped off at golf carts. And at the time when she went to public school, I was working in Atlanta public schools. And so I would leave dropping her off at a school where the PTA would do a direct drive and raise $50,000 to go to my work in Atlanta public schools where I needed to find coats and socks for kids to go to class so they can actually focus on learning because they can't do that if they're cold. And so then it was, okay, that is what this is. How is that possible? 20 minutes away, these students are really living in 2 different universes. And so that is really, I've always been in this education equity space, but not until I had my own child did I realize that it was an equity issue. And just to be clear, when we talk about equity, we talk about racial equity because it needs to be named. You have to call a thing a thing. And you have to understand that when you're not talking about race, as the underlying driver of all of these things, you start to talk about other issues, socioeconomics, and all of that other stuff. And where you're not talking about racism, you're now in escapism. So we are very clear about this is a racial equity issue.
Thank you. Awesome. Cynthia.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do I say now? Good morning. That's what I want to say.
Yeah.
And I think I would like to just say, and I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying, Caroline. We're here all to learn. And I think that someone spoke this morning about increasing our comprehension. And so I'm here to learn from you all as well. I am from Chicago, and I am a senior vice president at an organization called the Ounce of Prevention, and our mission is to ensure that every child in America, especially those most disadvantaged, have an equal start in life, that they are ready and prepared for kindergarten. That's really the basic mission. The organization itself really thinks about this and moves this agenda forward through the lens of what is high quality early childhood practice. What does the research say about the importance of early childhood? And then research program and advocacy. How do you actually make something happen through the voice of your organization, through the voice of the people in the community who are living with disparity every day? And so it's a 3-pronged approach. We have multiple programs that really focus on the early childhood space of children from birth, or actually prenatally through age 5. And we start prenatally because we know that learning begins at birth, but also learning begins with the mother who is expecting, or the father and the parent and the family who is expecting a child. And what is it that that child will need to be most successful in life? One of our signature programs that is spread across the country is a coast-to-coast network of early childhood demonstration projects. They're called Educare Schools. We intentionally name them schools and not centers to really signify that learning begins at birth. And so we want to align ourselves with the educational system. And so I'm here representing that early childhood space. When we really think about education here in America, we think about mandatory education beginning at kindergarten and going on through 12th grade. Just kind of backspace for myself, mandatory kindergarten is not mandatory in every state. Let's just be real about that. But we have a network of 23 schools and their demonstration projects, and what we use those for is to demonstrate what does high quality early childhood center-based education look like. Also as a place-based strategy, so that we bring in community members, business leaders, legislators, so that they can actually see what it looks like when we ask them to fund more early learning programs. Again, we really work with the children and their parents, because we really know that parents are the child's first and best teacher. We do not, think that we drop children off at centers and then it's all about the teachers taking care of children and then you hand them back to parents. That is not how our lives work, right? Because center-based programming and staff is only there 4 or 5 years. But we know that parents, mothers, and fathers are there for the entirety of a child's life. And so we want to see those parents involved and engaged in our early learning centers as well. Let's see, when I say a coast-to-coast network, we have the 23 schools are located in Maine, Seattle, Washington, Miami, Florida, as well as 2 in California now, and then stretched all across the Midwest. So we really are trying to put these schools in different communities. We don't want to have one on every corner. It's not like, no offense to a KinderCare or a Bright Horizons or anything like that, but the point is to really use them as demonstration centers so that people can actually see what every child in America deserves for their children 0 to 5. I'll pause there and then I'll just give you a little bit of information about my first encounter with inequity. And I don't tell this story often because it's very painful. And the story, I have multiple stories that are very painful. And that just is because of the world that we live in and what has been created as an inequitable society from the time that America was built. But my first experience was after kindergarten, actually, where I had gone to a local community public school in one community with my family. And my parents decided that they would move into another city in Chicago, the South Shore neighborhood. At that time, it was predominantly white. We were one of the first African-American families to live on that block. This story is repeated over and over and over by many African-Americans who integrated their communities and their neighborhoods. But I remember what was most striking was in first grade, I remember having a parent-teacher conference and my parents being at that conference and the teacher telling my parents that she can't read. And my parents thinking, what? What do you mean she can't read? Like, who's reading at 5 years old? Well, all the kids in that school were reading at 5 years old because that was their curriculum. They had the resource. In my other school, they were not teaching phonics and reading. So the disparity was already set up from the beginning. Why do we have these unequal curricula from day one that set us up for being behind? And so, my major, I think if I could share anything with you guys today is to remember that education does start really, really early, like at birth, and that if we are not providing the correct resources and supports for children and families, they're going to show up to school, even kindergarten and first grade, already behind. So that's the point that I really wanted to make today. And I just, I have just so many. I just want to, I think, share one additional one, and I'm going to leapfrog and kind of go forward, and you did the same kind of thing with like where you were and then going off to school. And I remember applying to colleges, and I remember counselors even in my high school trying to steer me to certain schools or universities where they thought that I could be successful versus allowing me to, if it was a stretch school, which is now what they're calling them, right? For now, our kids now, these are stretch schools. Trying to steer you in a path that perhaps wasn't your path. So I got the same kind of voice in my head, and our speaker talked about it yesterday, how you get stuck on the voice in your head about what people already have stereotyped you or described you to be. And I remember I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign, and I remember a counselor telling me I would never graduate from that university. Now, that was an 18-year-old young woman showing up, right, to have a pursuit of an education and being told by a supportive, supposedly adult person that you will never graduate from college. And I was not the only one that had that kind of constant, right? They're trying to distract you from achievement. And here I sit today, and you know, I have not just a bachelor's degree, I have a master's degree, and I'm a senior vice president, executive vice president at a corporation or a company. So what are we doing to our children? We have to have positive messages. And we need this community and other communities to reach out and help to be an advocate for our children that perhaps are less advantaged or different color or look different. And I agree with you, we do have to have race in the conversation because otherwise it does get watered down. So.
Thank you, Cynthia.
You're welcome.
I should say that we had a robust conversation last night, right before our keynote speaker blew our minds, and wanted to sort of establish some goals for our panel, which now, as I think about it, are really goals for me, at least for the whole conference, which is to really establish or share a definition of equity in my work that I can take back with me, but also to share parts of our work that can serve as inspiration or even sources of replication in our communities. And I think you've heard just from our introductions that there is ample possibilities for replication, whether it's bringing more early childhood advocacy or working with leaders and superintendents or working with communities to establish long-term relationships with kids. I mean, and many, many more. I want to come back, Kenita, to your point about racial equity and making sure that that adjective is attached. When I came back to South Carolina about 2 years ago, I was guns a-blazing about white privilege and racial justice, and it set a couple people off. You know, it's a tense topic, I think, particularly here in the South. I wonder how you manage that in your conversations, particularly with folks who aren't self-selecting into conversations like this.
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, how do we manage? Well, I think the data speaks for itself. Like, race is still the most reliable predictor of student success, period. Like, you can look at any other indicator, measurement of student success, health, whatever, it all breaks down by race. Data even show that, like, top students, Black students, still don't fare as well as like just average or poor mediocre white students in college. And so there has to be something, there's a there that we have to name.
Yeah.
I think I'm really fortunate in that I'm often in rooms where I'm preaching to the choir, so it's not a whole lot of, like, there may be some disagreements on what a solution looks like or how it's operationalized, but generally speaking, there's agreement on that it's a race issue. And when there's not, we just have to have these tough conversations. And like, we are clear up front, like, you might be uncomfortable during this time, during this conversation. You may want to walk out. You might feel like there's some accusation in some of this. And I'm like, you just have to own it and work through it. And so, like, I honestly am not often having to manage where it's like a contentious discussion.
Yeah.
Because I'm often in rooms like, we're here because we want to talk about this. But I will say we do, like in being our superintendents, know that, okay, these are going to be tough conversations. You have a board that you have to talk through this issue. You have community members. You have families or parents with this mentality of scarcity who are saying, if I give you more, you're taking away from mine. And so you do have to manage tough conversations, and all you can do is to say you have to just work through it and bear through it. And so, I mean, there is no easy way to have these conversations. If they were, we would be having them all the time. I think.
Right.
We'd have the solution
Yeah.
for the issue that we're here to think through and talk about today, if it was an easy conversation.
Yeah.
And I, you know, I find that I have to hold myself back oftentimes because I have a certain point of view. And I have to be able to listen to other people and try to understand their point of view without being offensive, because what we really want to do is really create community here, right? And with everybody that we're talking about, it's not about blaming, it's about understanding what our country has actually put into place, which is structural racism, right, from the very beginning. If you study education, which I did, you will learn that our educational system was constructed in a way that there would be laborers and there would be the learned. And so that sifting and sorting and separating and tracking still continues to this day. And it is because it's the way the educational system was built, and we continue to perpetuate that. However, I think that when we're in these conversations, and you know, you talked about, you know, you were guns ablaze with, you know, the white privilege. I almost cringe when I hear the conversation about the white privilege, because for me, it is a fact of life. And what is the conversation, right? And sometimes that white privilege conversation makes white folks uncomfortable, right? And that's not what it's meant to do. It's really meant to think about from an equity standpoint that, you know, there's one commercial that's on television right now, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but it shows a group of teenagers, as a matter of fact, all at a football field at a starting line together. And their facilitator of this group is asking questions of the group. If you have, for instance, studied abroad, take one step forward. If you had two parents in a household, take one step forward. If you drove to school and got picked up and dropped off every day by your parents, take one step forward. And then you look around, and at the end, you see that there's a group of children that are far ahead, and there's a group of children that are still at the starting line. That's inequity, right? The only reason is because they had more resources. And that's really what we're talking about. It's a lack of resources. It's divisive structures that are present that keep us in this situation where some have more than others.
Right.
And so when I think about the definition of equity, it's ensuring that people who need what they need get what they need. And it isn't equality. Everybody doesn't get the same. And the presenter last night, I can't remember his name.
Jeff.
I think he did a really excellent job of setting the frame for us in that perspective. But
Getting what they need
when they need it.
what they need when they need it,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Can I offer one?
Let's go to Liz real quick,
Okay.
and then we'll come back to you.
So I'm going to say something about the Episcopal context, even though I know that not everybody here is
Yeah,
Episcopalian or even church-based. And in terms of the question that I think that was at the heart of what you asked, which is how do we personally respond and sort of manage some of the challenges, difficulties of having conversations about equity. I think for those of us who are in the Episcopal context, we are in an organization that has a long history of the via media, meaning that we want to have a big tent where everybody gets along and we don't talk about hard things because it's impolite. And as part of our history, we have to remember that during slavery and the Civil War, when Episcopalians across the country got together, they argued about the hymnal, and that the Episcopal Church is the only mainline Protestant denomination that did not split over slavery, because we didn't talk about it. And so we couldn't offend anybody on either side. But I also think that we as Episcopalians and Christians, I would say, have to say that there are some things that are right and there are some things that are wrong. But this is against our culture as Episcopalians. Because we want to take the middle path.
Stay neutral.
Yeah. Howard Zinn, who's from Boston, talks about you can't be neutral on a moving train. And lots of other people have quotes too about, if you don't say something, silence is sort of the power of the oppressor. So I think that's one thing that just like, as Episcopalians, we need to like challenge this culture that we're in. And that we as white people think that we have the right to comfort. But I think that as people who care about justice and building the kingdom of God, I think we have to challenge even our own feelings of wanting to stay comfortable. And so I preach to some of those 50 Episcopal churches that are in the suburbs, and we also, our demographics are mostly white, let's be honest, at least here in the United States, not around the world, but here in the United States, the Episcopal Church is mostly white. And for me, when I think about what I'm going to say in my sermons, I try to figure out what the line is about being honest to myself, not misusing the stories of some of the young people that I work with to sort of pull at the heartstrings in a way that feels icky, for lack of a better word, but also discomforts the comfortable in an effort to comfort the afflicted, right?
Yeah. Kenita, did you have
I was
something
just
to
going to say, because the question I think was actually looking for like tools and suggestions.
Sure,
I think and I think when we talk about the conversations, like one of the main kind of tactics is to always keep children at the center of the conversation because it gets messy when we get into the adult mess.
Yeah.
And so that is one thing. And then language matters. And if you can try to keep it asset-based instead of deficit-based.
Yeah,
talking
absolutely.
about what we are aspiring to do instead of what we're doing wrong. That also helps.
Love it.
I mean, it's going to be tough, but like you know, and if you try to talk about issues and not people, that also helps.
Yeah, awesome. A question for all of you, and we're going to talk for about 10 more minutes and then open it up for question and answer. So you all get your questions ready. This is an overwhelming amount of work, right? I mean, we're talking about shifting systems in a way that hasn't been done, obviously. And we have unique perspectives here, a range of perspectives, national work, regional work, hyper-local, in your words. And really, actually, I expect that all of us are doing all of those all the time by virtue of our networks and so forth. One of the big questions that I have is how do we stay grounded in the sort of direct service and the sort of frontline work that we need to be doing and the relationships with individuals and students and parents, but also use that to inform sort of systemic advocacy at the same time. It can be so exhausting, I think, for educators and those of us who are in classrooms and schools on a regular basis and encountering this racist system, that we're tired at the end of the day. And then we have to take our fight to those in power. So how do you do both? Anybody?
So you're asking how we stay grounded and actually like be fatigued but still
yes.
Don't burn out. Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah,
Are you doing both actively?
Oh yeah, I mean.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to answer one way, and then you.
Sorry.
That's okay. Now,
Go with your gut.
Hopefully, I held on to this thought, and perhaps I did not. But I think that, when you're in it, sometimes you're in it and you're grinding, and you don't know how tired you are, and you don't know how much your voice is requested. And then you ask yourself the question, why me? Why my voice? And, it's because God said it's your voice that has to be offered up, and you cannot. There's no way tired, right? Like you've got to stay in it because if you can share your story personal, which the opportunity today to do a little bit of that here, that helps to move the needle on the conversation, right? That they can see it in the real living being, the person here that has experienced, right, inequity and racial injustice and segregation and all of those things that are the isms in this country that are so detestable, then you stay in the fight, because it is about social justice, and it isn't about the one individual. It's about all of our children. It's about all of our people. It's about humanity, right? And what is right and what is wrong. And so, you know, that for me is how I stay in it. And I used to wonder why people ask me questions all the time, and it's because I will stop long enough to try to give them an answer, but also try to hear what they're trying to, why they're asking a question, right? And then what can I learn from them? So that's, I'm not sure if I kind of did this with that question, because I kind of got a little confused, but you know, I think that for me is
I think
the
why
greatest thing.
somebody asks you to speak is often as important as the question itself, to know where they're coming from, particularly if it's a contentious.
Yeah, and I, you know, I think one other thing that I would add to that is the importance of listening, right? Like, this is not the work that I create or do myself. It's the work that I hear about what's happening to children and families on the ground. And so staying at the local level is, you know, really listening to the voice of the constituents. And constituents for me start with the parents and the community members, and then goes into, you know, those that are champions and advocates and people that want to see change happen. And so it's bringing all those advocacy voices together at the local level, and then, you know, sharing those at the national level also.
Awesome.
So I guess we could just go down the line.
Yeah, please.
So I think so there are a number of reasons, but I think it would be apropos to really talk about my faith first.
Sure.
And why that, like my grandmother would always have this quote, favor ain't fair. And so like really understanding that I've been, or as she would say, blessed and highly favored in a lot of ways, in that I've had, by all measures, I should have been a statistic, or I should have not ended up, or I should have been where my sister ended up, where she was pregnant by 16, dropped out of high school, no telling, you know, what's really going on in her life now. But for some reason, I was just not. And I know by doing on myself, it really is favor, I think. And so my faith tells me, okay, you didn't earn this, but you have to repay it somehow. So it's your duty to be out here to do this. And so that's one. I think the other thing is I really cannot escape it, in that this is my work, my professional work, and you know how that permeates everything. And then it's what I have studied at Yale. I did political science and history in African American studies. I did a master's in public policy at Michigan, and I did social welfare policy, and then I'm in a doctoral program working on racial equity issues. So like it is everywhere. So I have to do it. And then at the end of the day, I'm raising a little Black girl, and I'm hoping to have little Black grandbabies someday. And I need to make this world better for her, and I need to make this world better for them. And so I have to do this.
So I'm not gonna lie, I've been more discouraged this last year than I have been in a long time. And I've been doing some kind of activist organizing work for justice since I was in my late teens, so that's 30 years of doing this work. And I would say that this last year has been one of the hardest. And I think that's because I feel like we're under siege, and I think we are. And I also feel like rather than being in an effort to advance, it's gripping onto what we already have and getting pushed backwards. And I actually feel like there's a lot of language and tools from our evangelical brothers and sisters about being in a fight with demons and angels that is helpful sometimes to me in my faith to sort of understand what's going on around me. So one, I am discouraged. Two, what helps is that I don't do any of the work alone. We operate on teams. with lots of colleagues in our work, and I think that's part of what helps to keep my energy up. I think that kids are funny, and that when I get mostly discouraged, they laugh, they're joyful, they're great artists, and I have kids in my family, and I have kids that I work with, and I'm able, when I pay attention to it, to get recharged and refreshed by spending time, especially with the youngest kids. I like the truth-telling teens, too, but they're not always like necessarily that duty of delight that we're encouraged to be. And then when I'm at my best, I pay attention to self-care. I swim, I try to eat better, and I try to sleep enough. But it takes some conscious energy to make sure I limit my news intake.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
But it takes some conscious effort to make sure that I'm doing those self-care things.
Right.
But when I don't, I know that I don't have the same energy to go back and be in the work.
Right. So we're going to move to question and answer shortly, but one thing we didn't tackle in just this first part of the conversation is something we talked a bit about last night, which is we obviously right now exist in a system and structures that create inequity. But I wonder if we could start talking about the structures that will contribute to equity, and what are the sort of attributes or dynamics of an ecosystem that will create equity in schools. And some of those tools that we were just talking about last night are funding formulas, attendance zones in school districts, teachers, retaining teachers in classrooms. Obviously, Jeff talked quite a bit about relationships with individual students and the neuroscience around understanding their behavior, which I found deeply fascinating and encouraging. So just any thoughts before we move to question and answer, and I hope I'll see lots of hands on that.
So we work with leaders in a lot of ways because I feel like, or we feel like leadership is really that first essential lever of equity. And so if you have courageous leaders that are willing to lead this work, and so they need, and I think part of that initial or base level kind of structure is articulating a district-wide clear vision for what racial equity looks like in their district. So I think it begins with leadership. I think it begins with a clear vision. And I think then you have to examine what systems are working and what aren't, what systems keep the stratifications. And so, I mean, I think it's data is important, understanding and using data. I think looking at your curricula, like and curriculum, like what do all students have access to rich curricula? How are some students going into AP classes, and how are all of your special ed classes mostly Black and brown? Like you have to look at those type of things. I think the funding formula, but I think it's resource allocation overall, and a big part of that is human capital resources. And are all your novice first year teachers teaching the students who actually need the most advanced teachers or the most experienced teachers? So you have to look at those type of structures.
All right.
I think the only thing that I would look at
please.
in addition to that is, you did a fantastic job of just, checkpoint. The housing and the redlining, redistricting, and things of that nature that really keep people out of those districts. And every time you have an influx of, again, back to my experience, and it's not all about me. I'm just an example of the microcosm that happened in one little instance. Being the first African-American family in a predominantly white Jewish community, when those community members start moving out, right? They move away to the suburbs, and then, now it's 50 years later, 55 years later, actually, they're moving back into that community. And so they're, the gentrification is moving those families out. And so now they're going to become resource-rich communities again. But for 50 years, I can't say 50 because it was pretty good the whole time that I was there. But we saw the turnover, right? And then communities become, poor communities, right? So I think the housing, redistricting, redlining also has a huge
Yeah.
part to play in this.
Can I just say one
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
I think Cynthia's point is an important one in that there's a fallacy thinking that the school districts can do it alone,
Yeah.
and they can't.
Yeah.
We
Right.
can't.
Yeah.
And so it has
Yeah.
to be
Right.
community, multi-system,
Right.
multi-sector.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
kind of
That's
thing.
why that
Yeah.
question is like so like mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Like how do you actually how do you actually answer that question when this is again something that's been going on for a long time?
Yeah.
The only other thing that I would maybe add before we get to the questions is that it does start first internally, right? And so, you know, as we're looking at this topic, you know, within my own organization, I'm bringing that topic in my own organization because my organization is one that we are helping to set policy at the federal level, right? We're bringing comments so that policies will be supportive of children and families, but if we're not looking at those recommendations through an equity lens, then we could be cutting off our nose to spite our face. So we're starting in our own organization to look at educational equity so that we have an understanding of what that means to us. Because you can't do this work out there with others if you haven't done the work yourself, and it's a lot of hard work, as you said.
Yep. Questions? Okay, right here. Oh.
James has a mic, so please, when you have a question, if the mic comes to you, stand up, tell us your name, and if you can keep your questions brief and the answers brief,
Yes.
we can get through a lot more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Good morning. Thank you to each of you. It was a wonderful conversation. I'm Franca Floro. Greetings to you, Liz, from your fellow Long Islander.
Can
here
you
in the
speak up a
audience.
little bit more? We're having a hard
Yeah.
time hearing you.
I am a program director with the Diocese of Long Island. My
Okay.
question is directed to Liz. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
A little
Okay.
bit better.
What advice do you have for someone like me who might be able to engage a network of churches to be involved in this issue from your own experience, trying to, you know, gather them up and shore up some of the resources available in those churches in order to be influential in this work? And are there specific criteria that you look for in a church and its health and vitality before you extend that invitation? Or, you know, anything along those lines. And then I'm just also hoping that you know of the organization known as the National Mentoring Partnership. Because while many people want to do mentoring, too often they're not propped up to do it well, and low quality mentoring relationships can be more damaging. So are there things that you look for either in the church community, and
Got it.
what advice do you have?
Liz, before you answer,
Yes.
just a note that our next plenary panel is also addressing this topic of what churches are doing with school systems towards education equity. But please share your
I'll be
advice.
brief.
Yeah.
A strength of mine. That's not true. So I think that one of the questions that I wrestle with, and I think Episcopal churches wrestle with, is if we have to get our own, and this is actually similar to what you were just talking about. Do we have to get our own house in order and be strong and vital as a church before we can go out there? Or by going out there, do we become strong and vital and vibrant? And I think there is truth in having to do both at the same time, but I can say from our experience at St. Stephen's that we were a church in decline. When we began to have our youth programs, there were about 25 folks that came to church on Sunday. There was just about every problem you can imagine for a faith institution. The building was falling apart, the finances were a wreck, the leadership was fighting with each other. And it was by focusing outward and beginning to be relevant to the neighborhood that we began to get healthy ourselves. So when we invited people to come in, we did things that people can do. And this is my 2 days ago, the experience, I had it again on our day of action. People generally want to do the right thing. People generally want to do good. And people generally don't know what that looks like, don't know when to show up and what to do. So we said, come and feed the kids and sit with them while they're eating. Come and read with the kids and ask them about the book. And these things that most people know how to do began to build relationships. And those relationships began to transform the folks who maybe hadn't had those experiences. So then they didn't just care about the single child that they were working with, but they began to care about the equity issues that created the circumstance that they were now experiencing. So I think I could say a lot of other things, and we can talk afterwards. We are connected to other networks of mentoring organizations, Mass Mentoring, which is a statewide organization in Massachusetts. But for us, and for me, my opinion is the gospel calls us to go out of the doors. And then when we do that, we come back to the table for sustenance, not the other way around. And we get healthy that way.
Yeah, awesome.
Can I just
Yes,
add
please.
that if you're hesitant, please don't be. This work is risky and dangerous and political, and leaders need the community to provide cover for them. And the church has the ability to really galvanize and provide that cover. So I would say talk to your leaders, and you guys can work it through together. But like, we need the church.
Yeah. Next question. Yes. Just wait for the mic if you would, sir. Please do.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Ron Carrier from Richmond, Virginia. First question to you, ma'am, and please forgive me if I don't
Cynthia.
call you by name. Sure. But the program you're talking about, is that any connection with the old Head Start model?
Yes.
And my question,
It's
reason
not
for
an old
asking that
Head Start
question
model,
is
but yes.
how is that, in your terms, expanded to continue past the perceived level that the program comes to an end?
Yes. I think I have your question. So the Educare School model, the foundation is built on Head Start. And Head Start was expanded in the late 80s to include Early Head Start, which is the 0 to 3, so birth to 3 programming attached to then the 4s and the 5s, which is the original Head Start programming. So what's the other part of your question?
The other part is, does it carry forward? Because
Oh,
that program
yes,
is built around having to ensure you're having parents participate.
absolutely,
Early child care.
absolutely,
the whole bit.
yes,
From that point,
yes.
my idea is all the help that's given beforehand seemingly comes to an end,
At,
and it does not
Right.
continue, particularly when you deal with lack of equity.
yeah, I see what you're asking, and that's a huge question. So I'm going to answer it in one way, and if that's not the way that you were looking for, then I'll try something else, or we can try to talk about it later if we have time. But the Head Start program does involve a family-focused approach. So it does include the parents and the children, and then the parents or the children go off and they go to elementary school, and the schools are not as open to having parent participation in a lot of instances. So that is one of the issues that we run into. But the effects of, and I'm not sure, the effects of early childhood actually have been shown to be effective, but there is various research that says Head Start fades out. Well, why would something fade out in 3rd grade if you actually aren't responsible for the 3rd grade classrooms or the 1st grade or the 2nd grade? So that's part of the issue that we're having with trying to build that bridge between the Head Start or the early childhood frame and then the K through 12. So I'm not sure what else. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was actually understanding your full question, but let's have lunch with your wife.
Yeah. Next question. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, please.
There's 2 over here.
Dawn first, or yeah.
Nancy Cock, Concord, North Carolina. So the place that I continue to run up against issues again and again is something that you pointed out earlier. The system seems to work for whites, and it doesn't seem to work for blacks. And if your iron rule of community organizing is you can't ask people to work against their own self-interest, do you have talking points? Do you have places that you can point out how it actually isn't working for whites? Because the folks in power, as you said, are very eager to consolidate their power. They're not, and I would say the past year, what we've seen is a pushback to make sure that that power stays consolidated. At the top levels in our education, Department of Education now, it is not programs for equity, but programs to ensure, in fact, that the advantage continues to accrue. So my question is, you all are all working in this. Do we have anything beyond fairness? Because when I talk to people about fairness, That's a nice idea, but I want my kid to go to Harvard.
Right. Thank you. I can offer, in my work, while y'all are pondering, I have found that here in South Carolina, one of the most convincing arguments I can make is one of the economic interests of the state in strengthening the public education system for all kids. I think that we, even those in power who are often white males, understand that we're, to a certain extent, that we're all in this together. And that South Carolina will only remain competitive, particularly in the 21st century, to the extent that we're able to educate our workforce and our children. It's not a moral argument, and I hope that eventually it will lead them to that one. But at some point, you have to just get your foot in the door and speak the language that they're accustomed to. So for me, talking about sort of economic competitiveness and the public education system, an equitable public education system being key to economic growth is one way that I've done that.
Well, I want to bring in the thinking around poverty. Because when you are poor in America, you are less well-resourced. And so I think there's evidence, I know there's evidence that it isn't only African Americans or Latinos that are left behind, right? It's our brothers and sisters who are living in poverty here in America. And that is really one of the other challenges that I think has to be a part of this conversation, because poverty is about poor resources, right? And I think that, you know, as you talked about the work, you're really talking about workforce, right? Like one of the reasons why we want to do this in America, why we would like to increase education and have equity is because it is a workforce development issue. And, you know, one of the reasons why Head Start was started was Head Start and childcare more specifically, it was a lift out of poverty, right? So these things are not separate, these are connected. And so you have to talk about poverty when you talk about equity and educational equity also.
Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah.
So can you just say one more time the phrase? It's the idea that the system works for whites and kind of why
It doesn't work for all though, right?
Well, I think what I want to say is that that's fake news.
Oh my.
It's a myth.
Okay, I was trying to say it in another kind of way.
Let me say it this way.
There are more people that live in poverty
We
not.
have been sold a story that is not true. And it does work for the top 2 or 3% of whites. And while I want to keep racial equity front and center, and I appreciate what you said about poverty, I think we also have to name capitalism. And that is what creates the inequity that shows up as racial inequity. And what helps the system keep going is that the forces of production and the capital and that the wealth stays with the top percentage, who are mostly white. But they're not all the white folks. But part of what happens in the language and the way that we talk about it, and the us and the them and the separation, is that more whites feel like they can get into that group than blacks, and believe that there is an American dream where if I try hard enough and study hard enough, that I can make it into that group that has succeeded. And I don't think that that's true. And I don't think that that's what God promises us. And I don't think that we currently have the system that, again, as Christians, we are called to help co-create. And as a human being, I think that part of what the system does, and if you want language, like I am separated from my neighbors with the current system. I am damaged by that separation. I am not my best self because I did not know myself as fully as I now do when I only knew white people, and I only knew people who spoke English as their first language, and I only knew people who looked like me, talked like me, had similar experiences to me. And when I begin to have a more diverse connection of friends and colleagues and workmates, I'm a better person. I'm a more whole person in all of the complications and mistakes that I made in that process. And if part of what we're striving to do is to school our young people, not just educate our young people and help them to be moral beings, It's important that we all know people who are different from us, and the current inequitable system is deliberately designed to keep us separated with this myth that some people can get to the top and that the system is designed to keep most not there.
Don, I think you had a question here.
Thank you. My name is Don Coles from Richmond, Virginia. I'm still seeking a vision. So, and you could give me a vision of a great system, possibly, but I'd like to hear what it would look like in the school that's across the street from the church, the schools that your daughter will go to, and in a Educare school or child development centers. What should we see?
Who wants to get rich with the $1 million
Yeah.
or $10 million answer to this question?
Well,
There are some indicators.
Well, I actually can share with you a framework that we have shared with our leaders on what an equitable school look like. There are levers that need to happen, and I'm happy to share that with the whole conference if you want me to send it to you. I mean, so what it ultimately looks like is, again, race is not a predictor of student success. All students have what they need to reach their full social and academic potential and have choice-filled lives, whatever that looks like for them. And what we say, how that's operationalized, is one district-wide vision for equity that all people buy into, espouse, and work toward. All students have access to rich curricula options, and there's data driving the decisions about what academic choices look like for each student, that there are rich community partnerships, and that the community is buying in and supporting this district-wide vision for data, and that there are healthy school climates. Like, we have to think comprehensively about this. Like, how is health, how is transportation, how is homelessness, how are all these things impacting student success? And I'm trying to see what are the other, and human capital and resource allocation. So each of these are kind of spokes on a wheel that ultimately lead to an equitable district for students.
Any other?
I think, Don, I would, as I think about the school, which is called the Blackstone, that's across the street from us, and kind of what it looks like and feels like now compared to what it looked like and felt like 10 years ago. Because I think for those of you who are educators and teachers, you know this kind of workshop model. What does a good classroom look like, sound like, feel like, smell like, right? And I think that kind of is a test that we can use at a classroom level, a school level, a district level, a national education system level. So it looks like you can find the right front door. And it looks like there's a welcome sign, and it looks like people are smiling when you come in. It looks like it has a library with books that are relevant and up to date. It looks like classrooms that are staffed with well-trained, caring professionals that are the right proportion for the number of students who are in the class. And given who is in the class, that's different depending on how they're coming in. It looks like students are getting their basic physical needs met, coats, healthy food, social and emotional support with therapists and pediatricians so that they're ready to learn or ready to come back to the classroom. It looks like they're living and growing up in neighborhoods that are free from gunfire. It looks like they're living in housing that doesn't have vermin. And I think all of this contributes to what a good classroom and a good school looks like, and if we extrapolate that to the district level. And that's why I think we have to talk about the intersection of issues. I mean, you talked about housing, I would talk about health, I would talk about economic opportunity for teens and for their families. For schools, we know, and the evidence shows that when parents are engaged with schools, students do better. And when we have a system where jobs don't pay a livable wage, where immigrant parents in particular can't get jobs that pay a living wage, they have to work multiple jobs at shifts that are prevent them from participating in the school, that's not by accident. You know, that's by design, and if we want to ask questions about how to create a vision of what we want and not just what we're against, I want good jobs for our families that pay a living wage.
Absolutely.
So that then they can have the leisure time to participate in the schools.
And in
Because then their
child's
students are
learning.
going to do better.
Yeah. I think one of the challenges we have in this conversation about education equity is we focus on the deficits in the school system and within the school building itself, when really what happens in the classroom is a barometer of what's happening in society.
Yeah.
And when we cut wages or don't provide adequate health care, those problems don't go away. They show up in our classrooms. And we have teachers who have been trained in pedagogy and content, but not in social work or in even behavior management or how to work with traumatized children. So I think we've got to, as Liz is saying, take this more holistic, intersectional approach to the equity conversation. We have time for one more
Can I just add
question.
one
Yeah.
or two sentences? And I would
Yes.
again just name that churches are a place that can help to create that vision and solve that problem. We have the language of hope
Yes.
and possibility and kingdom, and we should like play with that and use that. And I also think that as churches and faith institutions decline for all the reasons that probably most of us could have a long conversation about, those sorts of community centers that met some of those other needs, like food pantries and clothing banks and places for folks to get sort of face-to-face human community, are declining. And we keep looking to the schools to do those things that other institutions, including but not limited to churches, used to do. And so we either need to become those churches again by opening our doors 7 days a week and starting to invite people in, not just if they come to worship on Sunday, or we need to also do some of the work to rebuild some of the other sorts of community institutions that we're doing that work that we now expect teachers and schools to do.
Yeah.
Can I add one more
Yes,
thing?
yeah.
And
Now we're
because
going.
it just hasn't
Yeah.
been said. Kids need to see teachers that look like them.
Yes. Yeah.
And the teachers that don't look like them need to understand them.
Yeah.
And so that's less cultural mismatch or whatever you
Right.
want to call it that lead to different conflicts. And I mean, that is a real issue.
Yeah.
And so that's also important
Yeah,
in the schools.
Anne, close us off.
Son. I just want to point out that there are
Will
actually...
you introduce yourself, Anne?
Sorry?
Will you introduce yourself?
I'm Ann Toohey. I'm from the Diocese of Chicago. I also am a colleague of Cynthia Jackson with the Ounce of Prevention Fund. So I will acknowledge that I have a bias for the importance of early childhood. But there is real evidence and examples throughout this country of public school systems that are incorporating all these things that we are talking about. And they've often occurred because people of faith, people who really care in the community, have worked together to bring resources so that you will have in a public school setting a combination of people who are going out into the community to identify pregnant moms, provide doulas and support for those moms while they're expecting their babies. They have incorporated family support systems within the public schools. They have early Head Start, they have Head Start, they have all-day Head Start, they have after-school programs, they have health centers, school nurses, doctors, dentists, all sorts of resources coming in. And almost all of those are funded by public monies, but it requires some private money and individuals who know how to bring those resources together to make it happen in one place. So I don't want us to leave on a note of thinking that everything is not working, because we do have evidence that things can work. We also have really good data, and I think it's important to distinguish, as Jeff said, between what is really real data and what we pass off as evidence of studies that haven't been complete. And I think one of the things that we can argue, and you want to base your arguments depending on the audience who's hearing the argument, but for people of privilege who have lots of money, who don't want to have their children suffer because they're bringing other people in who aren't so well educated, all the real data shows that when you bring people together, everybody gains. That really the ships do rise, they don't sink. And we save money because the more we invest, from the beginning of a child's life and their learning systems throughout, the more money we save and all of the interventions and incarceration and other sorts of bad things that happen later in life. And there's real solid evidence that that works. So I encourage you to go out of here knowing that you've got things and models on which you can build, and we all have the power to be participants in that process. And I thank all of you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you all. Yep. Lally, can I just say one? So thank you to our panelists. Quick plugs, Cynthia and Liz are both leading workshops, I think, so hear more about their work. Also, we had a panelist who was stricken with the flu, Genevieve Siegel-Hawley. I would highly recommend her work to you all. She has a book called When the Fences Come Down about disrupting housing policy as it's connected to school policy. So the housing and neighborhood issues that we talked about. But thank you all. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you.